I'll record this end and we'll let people in, okay?
Good.
Let's go. And
Bueno.
and I'm letting people in.
Buenas tardes a todos, ¿cómo están? Vamos a dar inicio a un nuevo evento de Fundación Libertad. Mientras se van sumando, todavía nos queda alguna gente en la sala de espera y otros más que van entrando. Hoy tenemos un verdadero placer, un privilegio, un honor. Estoy haciendo esta primera parte en español. Ella yo sé que entiende porque con su español cada vez que charlamos me sorprende. Luego vamos a hacerlo en inglés, es decir, vamos a continuar la conversación en inglés con ella, porque hoy tenemos a la profesora Deirdre McCloskey, directo desde los Estados Unidos de América. Ahí está saludando desde Chicago con el Gran Cañón de fondo. Yo voy a hacer la presentación ahora en inglés. El año pasado, cuando la tuvimos aquí también vía online, la habíamos hecho en español. Esta vez la vamos a hacer en inglés. Ya la tuvimos además en el 2019, mayo de 2019, con nosotros en Argentina, en Buenos Aires, recorriendo esa semana la ciudad en sendos eventos, y para nosotros fue un verdadero gusto. Y ahora voy a pasar al inglés para el resto de la charla. Sí, los invitamos a que vayan utilizando el chat, la ventanita de chat que tienen al costado, para poder luego compartir con nosotros, dejar preguntas, para poder charlar con Deirdre. So now I'm going to English. We're going to have the rest of the conversation in English, but I know that Deirdre understood what I was saying. As I said,
of course.
As I said, she speaks Spanish, and she always learns new words, and she always surprises me.
No, I don't.
Exchange. Oh, you do, Deirdre, you do.
No, I don't. Here, I have a Spanish joke. A person who knows 3 languages is called trilingual. A person who knows 2 is called bilingual. A person who knows 1 is called una gringa.
I always like that one, because that's a bilingual joke as well. So it has 2 languages. As I was saying, I was going to do now the formal introduction, and now in English, as Deirdre always has on her website. Deirdre N. McCloskey has been since 2000 UIC Distinguished Professor of Economics, History, English, and Communication at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Trained at Harvard as an economist, she has written 20 books and edited 7 more, and has published some 400 articles on economic theory, economic history, philosophy, rhetoric, as she always says, rhetoric, that's the way to pronounce it in English, feminism, ethics, and law. She taught for 12 years in economics at the University of Chicago, and describes herself now, and she's always updating her description. That's what I always like. Her latest description is on her official website as a postmodern free market quantitative Episcopalian feminist Aristotelian. The Aristotelian part is new one, but she also has the classic version. She describes herself as a literary, quantitative, postmodern, free market, progressive Episcopalian, ex-Marxist, Midwestern woman from Boston who was once a man, not conservative. I'm a Christian classical liberal. That's what she always says in the classic version of this presentation. She has written so many books. You know her, of course, because of the Bourgeois Virtues, that trilogy that is really inked in our hearts. Her latest book, at least one of her latest books, is Why Liberalism Works, How True Liberal Values Produce a Freer, More Equal, Prosperous World for All. That's how we title this presentation, and that's why, Deirdre, we are pleased of having you, and that's why we want to start with that very question. Why does liberalism work?
Well, it's great to be in Argentina, even though I'm in Chicago. It works, as you can see, in the very medium we're in, because under liberalism, under even an approximation of it, which you have in Argentina, I have in my country, even though it's not perfect, it's much better than it once was, the permission to try things out. So the people who invented Zoom, they thought, well, and this was before the COVID, they thought, well, let's have a meeting technology, and there are lots of other people trying to do the same thing. And this here's the analogy that I like people to get in their heads. We wouldn't want to centrally plan art, music, science, love affairs, friendship. We wouldn't want there to be a ministry of friendship that would tell us who to make friends with. And in the same way, if we have the core of liberalism, therefore, is an equality of permission. That's the crucial word. Not an equality of opportunity, as people often say, but letting you open a business when you want, or move to another part of the country to work, buy from whom you wish. This is, I know, a very big issue in Argentina, which has a long history of preventing people from buying from foreigners in aid in order to protect one group of Argentinians and hurt everyone else. So it works, and it's new comparatively. I'm a historian as well as an economist, and so I think that that the 1700s were just yesterday in my mind. And that's when this idea came. And it was amazing. Here's how well it worked. Argentina, the United States, France, Italy, China, Finland, Japan, name the country. The average person is 20 to 40 times, so hear that, 20 to 40 times better off than they were in 1800. That's not doubling or tripling, that's 2,000% or 4,000% increase. So this equality of permission works.
Deirdre, I want to follow up with a question that ties with what's been going on, and that ties back to our latest conversation with you that we had last year, that we had to have through Zoom because the pandemic was already starting. It was barely starting, actually, because it was back in April, back in May 2020. Since you can analyze things not only from a personal viewpoint, but also from a professional viewpoint because of your expertise. What have you learned during the past year from humanity, from the way that we have reacted to the pandemic?
Well, I've learned that, but I already knew this. I learned that people are rather, what would we say, simple-minded about economics and don't quite understand it. That I've learned that it's rather easy for the government to panic people. The great American journalist of a century ago, Henry L. Mencken, said once that the job of a politician is to terrify people and then offer the solution. Argentinian manufacturing is in terrible shape because we let Brazilians or Americans or Chinese people send goods to Argentina. We must cut oh my God, let's save ourselves. Let's stop trade with Brazil. And that's how the government has reacted to COVID. Now, on the other hand, I think that in a plague, thank God it's not worse. Thank God it's not Ebola or the Black Death or something like that, where the mortality is much, much higher. but in a plague, there is a role for the state. But the state keeps not doing it very well. I don't know. I try to learn from experience, but I'm a slow thinker, so it always takes me a year or two to realize what I learned, to recognize it. Oh yeah, that's why my forehead is sloped, because I keep saying, oh my God, oh.
So the next question, Deirdre, and I really liked this idea that you posed about people in general being simple-minded about economics and politicians frightening us into offering then a solution to the problems that maybe they themselves fabricated. I'm going to do what corresponds when I say this name, Adam Smith, right? I did.
I always cross myself.
So we both did. Do you think Adam Smith, woman of the system, has gotten worse this year?
Well, it depends. I mean, the other day they were saying about Germany, which at first looked very competent in the German way, the usual German way, in handling the epidemic. Now, confidence in the competence of the government is falling in Germany, of all places. Now there's a third wave. So I don't know. It's a mixed bag. I hope people realize that that government. I'm not an anarchist. I have friends who are anarchists, and I love them. But I'm a liberal. I'm a John Stuart Mill type liberal, Milton Friedman type liberal. And so I believe, as I said before, that there's a role for government. The problem is, it's like the old Arabic proverb, if you let the nose of the camel into the tent, pretty soon the camel is all the way in the tent. And that's the danger. And it's a vivid, important danger in Argentinian economic history. I don't need to tell you.
It really is, Deirdre, and I can't stop thinking now about the camel that you mentioned, because I think that one issue that has been worrisome, at least in South America, but also in many parts of the world, has been about education, about how some measures, for example, closing schools and not letting kids attend them. In Argentina in 2020, they had no classes in person throughout the whole school year, which poses many questions on the damage that may have been caused to these kids. Do you feel that the values that you work so much on your bourgeois dignity trilogy are at risk nowadays, Deirdre?
They're always at risk, which is a shame. But I write these books, and you work in your institute to change people's minds. We haven't got the army behind us. Thank God, I'm glad. One of the problems with Chilean liberalism is that liberalism came from the army. It came from coercion. And that's been a deep worry in Chile ever since. So all we have is our abilities, whatever they are, to persuade, sweet talk, as I call it, sweet talk. And once liberalism was the ideology that people held in their heart. In 19th century Argentina, in the Argentina of the 1800s, liberalism was how people were taught. If they went to France to university or something, that's what they learned. But then in the last century, it's changed. And now when people go to university, they learn Marxism, as I did. I was once a socialist myself. And it's very hard to get out of that mentality. That's one point. I'm a kind of sort of among the what I call the clerisy, the intellectuals, the journalists and so forth. That's the problem, is this educational problem. But then on the side of just ordinary people, the problem is that they've come to expect the government to take care of themselves, of them. I think of it, and here's the problem. Here's why we always need to argue against it and try to get people back to thinking of themselves as adults. Another word for liberalism would be adultism, because all the other philosophies, in one way or another, treat ordinary people like children. If the philosophy is conservative, then it's the children are bad children and need to be crushed, and you need to bring out the police and the army. If it's on the left, they're sad, pathetic, silly children, and they need to be regulated and corrected and taken care of. So particularly, I think this kind of talk might appeal to young people. Young people want to be adults. Well, here's your chance, kids. Be a liberal.
Always listening to you, Deirdre, and speaking with you, there appear so many different ideas and paths that we can take for this discussion. So I'd like to follow. We'll leave the role of government for later, because I think that there's a really big discussion to have there, a really interesting one. But I'd like to follow the path that has to do with your own personal experience, which you have explained from time to time, and you just said so when it comes to Marxism that is taught in universities. That happens as well in Argentina. You get Marxism, you get Keynesianism, and those are the mainstream ideas in Argentina and have been so for at least the past 50 to 60 years. I mean, unchanged. And I guess that part of what we do is try to push forward and present the ideas of liberty, and that's a way of helping people find them. But how did you find the ideas of liberty and leave the ideas of Marxism behind in your own personal and professional experience?
Well, it was very slow. It was not a road to Damascus like St. Paul. Suddenly I saw the truth. I was an anarchist to begin with, except a socialist anarchist. This was when I was about 15 or 16 years old. I followed Prince Kropotkin in Russia, who was a wonderful man in many ways, a 19th century anarchist. And then I see, look, I'm very old. I was born in 1942. So
you are not old, Deirdre. Old is the wind. Old is the wind, and it keeps blowing.
That's right. Don't do the arithmetic. It's very surprising. So I was a socialist in the way that everyone was. I was not ever a communist. If I was any kind of communist, I was a Trotskyist, a kind of loose Trotskyist. But then, what was on offer at Harvard College, where I went, was Keynesian thinking, which is kind of social engineering, socialism light, but it's actually turned out to be rather heavy. It's the idea that everyone's a child and we need to help you. And the old joke is one of the most unbelievable sentences in English is, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you."
You actually tell that one as the three lies joke. I've seen you on the stage saying that one, which is great. I don't know if you want to remind the audience about the three lies.
It's an old joke. One of the male habits I've kept, and I apologize for it, is that I do like telling jokes. I have a little group of them that I tell all the time, and one of them is classic. The three most unbelievable sentences in English, and they would be very easy to translate into Spanish. The first is, the check is in the mail. You know, mañana, pasado mañana. The second one is, of course, I'll respect you in the morning. Think about it. The third one is, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. And in the 1960s, I was against the war in Vietnam and so forth, but I was a social engineer. We graduates of Harvard and Princeton and Yale were going to go down to Washington and help you. Whether you like it or not, we were going to help you. And then my first job was at the University of Chicago, and I was tenured there, and I was there for 12 years. And I had already, even before I went to Chicago, started to think of economics as something you could really apply. And there were a number of other there were a number of people who influenced me. So I gradually turned. I'm fond of saying I've been everything in my life except a European-style conservative. I've never been that, but everything else. And it's an advantage, actually. I have lots of friends who have always been liberals. They read, I don't know, Ayn Rand or something, and then when they were 18, you can only like Ayn Rand if you read her when you're 18. If you try to read her when you're 38, it doesn't work out well, because I don't like her novels. But anyway, but they've always been like that. But whereas I still have lots of friends who are socialists, and it helps, because then you're at least they're not evil people or even stupid. It's just, it's kind of strange about economics, because some of the things that economics says are very simple once you understand them. But I think that's true of lots of things.
I'm going to say the next thing in Spanish because it's for the audience.
Sí.
Siéntanse libres de sumar en el chat si quieren hacer preguntas, las pueden hacer en español, así que no tengan miedo. I was just inviting people to write in the chat box if they feel like it, that they shouldn't hesitate on doing so.
No.
I'm
the answer lady. I can answer any question about your love life. You want advice? I'm here to answer your questions.
I always liked those old robots that they had at fairs where you had to put a coin.
yeah, that's right.
And you could ask a question. We never had those, but I always saw them in movies, so that's why.
The same thing is Chinese Chinese cookies. What are they called? Where you get that, by the way, was invented in the United States.
The fortune cookies.
Cookies. They're not Chinese. They were invented in the United States.
but if you have to have Chinese food at an American restaurant, then you're going to get them. Of course, that's the full American experience.
Yeah.
You just told us, Deirdre, that bourgeois dignity values are always at risk. Do you perceive, as an economist and as a historian, a change in values coming in, something that is different from what it used to be before in the economic sense, in the political sense?
I think it's easy to exaggerate how much it's changed recently. But I think there was a big change about a century ago. And there ought to be more academic work on this, because I think it happened in Argentina and the United States at about the same time. In the 1920s and 30s, there was this big shift to the child view of the citizen. Now understand, I talk of myself as a Christian liberal. So I acknowledge an obligation that you and I have towards the poor, for example. But the main obligation we have is to give the poor permission to start a business, to own the land under their favela, to enter any occupation they want, to buy anywhere they want. And if you do that, the working class, the poor people, get rich, and that's the main way you should help the poor. But I'm not against helping people in a disaster, if there's a flood or something, or if they're very poor or they're being abused by their husband or something. I think there's a role for the state for coercion. But the problem is the nose of the camel. There's this kind of slip that, as they say in philosophy, there is a slippery slope, and we started slipping about 100 years ago, and that's been the big ideological change in the West. Look, once the camel was so to speak already in the tent. That was back in the 1700s. Except it was another camel. This analogy is getting kind of crazy, but the camel then was hierarchy. Was, if you're a wife, your husband is your master. If you're black, your master is your master. If you're a subject of the king is the master. Everyone had a master. And that was broken down in liberalism. Another way to describe liberalism is it's the ideal of a masterless society. In the last 3 centuries, the intelligentsia of Europe, the clerisy, has had 3 ideas. The first one was liberalism, breaking down masters. The second one was nationalism, where the master is the nation. And the third is socialism, where the master of the economy is the state. And the second 2 are terrible ideas. If you think you like nationalism and socialism, maybe you'll like National Socialism, which, as you know, is the official name of Hitler's political party. Masterlessness is what we should be looking for. That doesn't mean you don't help people. It just means you don't boss them around.
That's quite clear, Deirdre. We are starting getting questions from the audience. We have one from Guicho Nacle. He says, Professor, do you think we should change how we measure GDP, taking into account green capital? How could we make capitalism ecological sustainable, he asks.
Well, I worry about global warming, as I think any sensible person should. But, we've solved a lot of environmental problems by the way, I don't much like the word capitalism. I can explain that if you want, but in a market way. For example, Margaret Thatcher was one of the leaders against hairspray, and by the way, air conditioning fluid that was causing a hole in the ozone layer at the North and South poles. Margaret Thatcher, the so-called conservative, and a big user of hairspray, by the way. She always has these big hairdos.
As we saw on The Crown season 4.
That's right. That's right. That was a very unsympathetic portrait of Margaret. But she worked with other governments, again, a role for government. And we solved this problem. The hole in the ozone layer declines every year, gets smaller and smaller and smaller. 100 years ago, there was a really terrible problem of, not 100 years ago, half a century ago, there was a terrible problem of air pollution, urban air pollution in Los Angeles and everywhere else. And that was solved with taxation of gasoline and so forth. So there are market ways of doing it. And that's what I recommend.
We have one from Roberto Brenes. He says, Professor, I found your critique of Piketty's Capital incisive. Would you like to add something on that, Deirdre?
Yeah, and in fact, in this book that you mentioned, which is
I think we have Roberto who would like to add something. I just unmuted him if he wants to add.
Sure.
Professor, the question went just half of the question. When you critique Piketty, which I think you're being, really gentle to Piketty, you brought an issue which I find very interesting, is that you point out, almost as a matter of fact, that Marxists deal with the problem of supply response as it doesn't exist.
Yeah, that's right.
And when we look at what Marxists and all the statist governments in Latin America, for example, do, is always put in bureaucracy and all sorts of problems, that in fact what they do is to hamper and cripple supply response.
That's right.
And I think we have not looked into this issue of supply response as we should.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. And I keep seeing exactly what you're saying, the absence of supply response in the attitudes of professional economists, people who claim to know economics. And yet they think that well, for example, Piketty thinks that the only way to solve a shortage of oil is for the government to take over the oil wells or something, because no more oil will be produced if the price goes up. Now, this is loco. I think we have to agree. This is insane. And it's been shown over and over and over again in the history of the oil industry in the last, 100 years. The higher the price of oil, the more oil is provided.
Deirdre, we have a question from Federico Hernandez. He says, let me imagine why you don't want the word capitalism. Is it because that word is a reduction of human freedom to the economic angle? That's what he asked.
No, although I agree with him that we must not reduce our lives to economics exclusively or to the economic angle. No, the main reason is that it's scientifically misleading. The word is a scientific error compressed into a single word. And the error is this. The error is that we got rich from investment. We got rich from accumulating capital. And that is false. Now, unfortunately, even Adam Smith, I cross myself again, he believed this. And economists have thought this ever since Adam Smith. Marx was a student of Adam Smith and a fairly intelligent one, and he believed it. And people think that because it's called capitalism, accumulation must be the heart of it. But the fact is that if you look around you, you can see immediately that although you sometimes need the investment, sometimes the accumulation is necessary, not always, but sometimes. What's unusual about the modern world is innovation. It's the new ideas that make investment valuable that are important. Look, take containerization. This character in North Carolina in 1956, named Mackay, was that his name? No, Malcolm McLean said, let's make standardized boxes with corrugated sides, so they're strong, can be piled on top of each other, and fill them with goods and send them to China. And then they can send them back. That's just an idea. Now, of course, you needed the capital to make it happen, but you also needed a labor force and the rule of law and the absence of a world war and all kinds of the sunlight and the existence of humans and all kinds of, they're an infinite number of necessary conditions. But what was sufficient to make it happen was the idea, was the creativity of an individual having permission to try it out. So I want to call it innovism. I want us to stop using the word, very misleading word, capitalism, and call what we live in right now innovism. And that'll turn our mind in Argentina and everywhere else to the conditions of innovation and thinking, oh, I see. Well, you've got to have free speech if you're going to have innovation. So I guess I better be in favor of that too. We better have gender freedom, such as we didn't have, and certainly in the United States, although this is much less so, I've learned, in Latin America than in the United States. Liberty is liberty, and it's completely clear that slaves don't innovate. Children don't innovate. Small children don't. All linguistic change is caused by teenagers, precisely because they found their freedom in making up new ways of speaking Spanish or English. So that's sorry, I could go on for an hour, but I won't.
But we are happy with everything you're saying, Deirdre. The audience is so as well. Federico just put very good answer. Thank you. We got a thank you from Guisho and Claire as well. Actually, I'm going to take a forking path as well, because you just mentioned something that I think is quite topical and quite important nowadays, which has to do with gender issues. Why do you think, Deirdre, that this important issue has been primarily taken, if we can still use that distinction, by the left instead of the whole political spectrum, at least in South America?
I'm not quite sure what you mean. You mean the idea of gender itself?
The discussion on gender and why it's such an important thing to have on the table.
Well, I think it is important, and I agree with my colleagues on the left. The problem is that there are some of them, so-called TERFs, TERF, trans exclusionary radical feminists. For some reason, this group, these TERFs, are very, very influential in Britain, of all places. It's quite surprising. Not so much in the United States, but and certainly not in Argentina, I don't think. But
including a famous British author.
Yeah, well, a number of them. Yeah, that's right. In fact, I signed an open letter that appeared in Harper's Magazine that Harper's asked people to sign. And both she and I signed the letter. It was a very moderate appeal for free speech. Because although I don't agree with Rowling's views about transgender people, including me, I think she should be allowed to speak. I think her childish books are kind of childish, but that's okay. That's her right to. So it's not that I want these people to be dismissed from their job or anything like that, but I do believe that gender liberty of various kinds is very important, especially, of course, feminism, the liberty of women, whether born women or trans women, to be adults, to be treated as adults, and to be free to choose, as Milton Friedman and Rose said. In fact, Milton and Rose, I went to Milton's, what was it, his 90th birthday. And I was Deirdre by then, I had changed. And they were very courteous, exactly as you would expect real advocates, real practitioners of liberty to be.
Deirdre, we spoke about this last year. We spoke a little bit before starting this conversation today, and it comes down to politics and values and how things are going. Now we know the results of the 2020 election.
Thank God.
How would you explain? I know that you said that it will probably take you a whole year to actually decide on how to explain what just happened. But
Yeah.
how do you explain the Trump phenomenon?
Well, look. It's every country, and again, I don't need to tell Argentinians this. They've experienced it on their pulse. Has fascists. There are fascist impulses in France, certainly in China. I mean, anywhere you look, there are going to be groups that are nationalist and socialist at the same time. National socialists. And I don't throw around the word freely, but I think in a precise sense, Trump has shown himself over and over again, especially in this horrible business on January 6th, as a fascist, and his followers are fascists. But so Biden is a statist, but a statist is not a fascist, although fascism involves statism. The statism being the idea that all problems are to be taken care of by the government and not by individual permission. But he's not a it's a great improvement, express it that way. I mean, it's like moving from the generals in Argentina to a democracy. Now, I think everyone in Argentina will agree, whether left, right, or liberal, that Argentinian politics is really crazy, loco. I mean, this is nuts, but it's still democratic.
I mean, it is. I like the loco thing because, as you know, we have a president that was chosen by the vice president to be the candidate, which I think it's something that I know we Argentines like to think that we are exceptionals and that we are all so different from the rest of the world in ways that we really are not, because there are many patterns that are always seen across the world. But I think that we do have the first president that was chosen by a vice president, at least in modern times, which is not something to be proud of, but as you said, we know about local stuff. Following on another issue that I've gotten on personal messages of people that are watching our conversation, and it has to do with statistics, because many people have been worried about how to interpret them, how they are collected, the data.
Yeah.
When it comes to COVID, what do you think about COVID statistics? What do you think that they can tell us about what's been going on?
Well, there are high-level theoretical problems that I'm not going to get into, because I'm not an epidemiologist. But it's quite clear I'll speak of my own country. We really did a bad job early on testing. And I don't see how you can fight a plague if you don't know who's sick. And the problem with this particular bug, this virus, is that it's quite unusual in people getting sick without knowing it. I mean, people say, oh, it's like the flu. No, it's not. If you've got the flu, you know you've got the flu. If you got Ebola, you really know you've got Ebola. Not this one, which makes it very important. If this role of the state is going to be done intelligently, you got to test. But we didn't, and I think it's true in Argentina. It's certainly true in Brazil that they didn't test, and now it's completely chaotic. So, you know, look, as I told you, in my youth, I thought of myself as an economic engineer, right? I was going to choose your life for you. Well,
we're gonna run the Ministry of Friendship and tell
I
us
was
who
going
to be friends with.
That's right. You've got to work with her, not with him. You know, blah blah blah. But that's if you're going to do that, at least you should have the engineer's attitude. I admire engineers very much, and I've followed engineering intellectual attitudes all my life in a lot of ways. I always ask, how big, how much? That's a characteristically engineering question. And of course you need to have the information if you're going to be a social engineer. And I think it's very foolish to be rushing off in one direction or another without knowing what the pattern of infection is.
We also discussed a thing before we started that I think it's worth sharing with the audience, Deirdre. It has to do with something that has been taking place for the last 4,000 years, and in Argentina it has been taking place since ever, which has to do with the control of prices. We were talking about the USSR, we were talking about how the vaccines are distributed. Argentina actually has in place a control prices program where they are persecuting companies because they might be asking for an extra peso on the bag of cookies or whatever. What can you tell us about control prices in 2021, the 21st century?
Yeah, it's never worked. It always doesn't work. As soon as you prohibit something, you create a black market, a pressure to allocate it in some other fashion, with violence or with influence or with under the table payments of money or with politics. And it's in the United States, we had a little teeny experiment with socialism. We have quite a few of them actually, but this one experiment with COVID vaccine, I spent personally many days looking for a shot. I won't go into the details, but everyone was doing this, and they still are. They're rushing around, wasting money and time and effort and being anxious, when if they had allocated the flu shots the way we allocate bread or, ice cream, then people like me who I'm not rich, but I'm well-to-do, I would pay $100 to get a shot, and then we would give vouchers to poor people. And if you wish, have special programs to go into the favelas or into the poor areas and help people get the shots. I don't mind that. There is an externality involved, and it's quite plain in the case of disease. All right, but as I'm fond of saying, if we allocated food the way we are now allocating COVID shots, we'd starve. How do I know that? because it's happened over and over and over again. I have some jokes about that too.
Please do tell us, Deirdre, the jokes,
Well,
of course.
I'll truncate it. This is from Poland. I was there in 1988, and that's when before communism fell, and I heard this joke. The wife sends the man to the meat store, to the butcher, to get meat. And he goes there, and there's this long line, meat at the controlled price, at the legal price. And he waits for an hour. He's finally within 3 of the front, and the butcher, the man selling the meat, says, "We're out of meat," closes the thing. The guy gets really angry, and he starts shouting. There's still lots of people in the store. He says, "We've got to get rid of this communism. This is terrible. It's nuts that we can't buy meat." And a man in a trench coat, he's obviously a secret policeman. He comes up. Now you have to watch what I do. He says to the man, "Comrade, you can't talk like that." And he goes like this. Now watch. Right? As though it were a gun, right? He doesn't shoot him, but he does it with his hand. So the guy goes home, and his wife says, "Do you get any meat?" "Of course I didn't get any meat, this stupid communist country." But there's worse news. They're out of bullets. I love that joke. Because the only way you can run such a system is if you have the bullets.
No, I was laughing a second ago. Now I'm worried.
Yeah, that's right. It shows the power of coercion.
Yeah, which I guess it also showcases how good jokes make you worry. They ring true. We are getting close to our last minutes of the allocated hour, Deirdre. With you, I still have a couple of questions. People are laughing on the chat, and they are on the last joke. I have an open question for one of the last ones, or maybe the last one, which I think it ties. I mean, it's kind of hard pinpointing what's going to happen in the future, but since you are the answer lady and you have all the answers, which you said beforehand, we're going to take advantage of that. And with this. With your answer, I guess we'll see whether you're an optimist on what's ahead or not as well. Do you see a more open world after the pandemic, or a more closed one?
Well, that's the question of the hour. That's the big question. Will people take away from the pandemic the idea that we really need government to be bigger? Or will they take away from the pandemic the stupidity of governments in the United States, Brazil, especially those two, and say, "My God, we don't want very much of this." But a long time ago, I wrote a book which has been translated into Spanish. Can you see it?
Which we cannot see. We are seeing the Grand Canyon.
Yeah, well, I would have to turn off the Grand Canyon.
If you're so smart.
Yeah. If you're so smart, the narrative of economic expertise, and it's a powerful point. If I was so smart, if I really knew, I could make a fortune, and so could you. So all we can do as liberals is to preach, to speak, to be as articulate and clear as we can, to try to get people to want to be free adults, to not want to have masters. And the trouble is that lots of people want to be children. They want to have a master. And I want to persuade them that that's not a dignified life for a human being.
That was great, Deirdre. And that was actually the last question, but I have another one. Are we getting you in Argentina as soon as the pandemic is over? Can we
Absolutely.
get you here? Perfect.
Absolutely. I want some of that Argentinian beef, a big slab of it on the barbecue. And I want to see some more tango. You know, the only other country in the world that is obsessed by tango?
Japan and Finland, right?
Yes, Japan and especially Finland. And I went to Finland for the first time 3 years ago, maybe it was 2. And I said, look, I'll come if you get a big Finn to dance the tango with me, because I want to be dipped, you know, and when you're dipped before I die. And they did. They got a big Finnish tango instructor to dance with me, and I loved it.
So it's a done deal, Deirdre. We are getting you back to Argentina as soon as.
And honestly, I want to see more of the country. It was great to be there, but I'd like to see the Pampas, and I'd like to in Buenos Aires itself. I'd like to see the sort of remnants of
Borges.
Yes, Borges, whose poetry and essays I love.
We'll be delighted to have you, Deirdre, as soon as possible. And we are also thankful for having you, for all of us, for this enchanting hour. I think that people are also as happy as I am on the other side on their screens. They are writing on chat. Some of them we can see with their cameras on. So we want to thank you, Deirdre, for joining us today. It has been an awesome experience as always, and we always enjoy the way that you reflect on things and help us understand them a little bit better. And we hope to see you soon next time, and see you here in Argentina, of course, as well.
Okay, chao, chao.
Muchas gracias a todos. Damos por concluido el evento de hoy con Deirdre McCloskey, la profesora Deirdre McCloskey, aquí en Fundación Libertad. Ha sido un placer de nuestra parte. Sigan conectados todos con los eventos de Fundación Libertad. Damos por cerrado la charla de hoy. Thank you very much, Deirdre. We are closing the event. Thanks to everyone for joining us. Bye-bye.